a large crowd. Welcome to Turner Dodge House. I am retired Judge Glenn Allen. 5 years ago I was president of Turner Dodge. Our present president is Ed Carpenter, and I've been asked to make the introduction of our guest because I knew him some 10 years ago when I had been the recent budget director under George Romney and Governor Milliken, and a big historic renovation project was undertaken in the state capitol by a team of experts, of whom one was our guest here tonight, Ron Koenig. He did a remarkable job with the other members, and you know what the Capitol looks like and how grand and historic it is. And that led him on to other developments to perfect this talent that he has about historic renovation. He went to the University of Pennsylvania, where he obtained a degree in building conservation. He came back and worked at Midland on a restoration of the courthouse in Midland, and he worked with Steve Sebone, who some of us will remember, some of you will remember, as one of the key people who worked on the Capitol. He then went up to a little island up north at Mackinac and did work on the fort at the Mackinac Fort and other projects up at Mackinac. One of which was the renovation in a historic way of the governor's summer home. That summer home, and I know this very well because it happened when Romney became governor. I was in charge of that house. One of the things I first learned about the house is if you had a crowd as big as this, you had to be careful and put some more supports underneath the basement or it would fall in. Well, our guest got that all corrected. He then became a curator at Greenfield Village for a while. And he now, among other things, is working on a project for the restoration of what is called the Adams House in South Dakota. He's working on the historic renovation of 2 hotels in Chicago. He's working on the restoration of the Detroit Athletic Club and on the University of Michigan Law Library. He has a very talented mother. She's a professor of law at Cooley Law School. It's my pleasure to introduce to you Ron Koenig, our guest for tonight, who will talk about the color of the walls and everything else about this.
Thank you all for having me here tonight. I want this to be as informal as possible. I know that it seems like a large crowd, but I think if people have questions as we go along, raise your hand, and hopefully I'll see. If I don't see you, throw something at me, whatever it takes to get my attention. But as we go along, just go ahead and ask questions because I prefer it that way. In the last couple of decades, Lansing has lost some of its finest historic buildings to the wrecking ball and to so-called progress. This building, along with the Darius Moon houses in the state capitol, represents some of the best that survived from our Victorian past. Now, many people think that Victorian buildings are superior to modern architecture. A lot of people think that old thing about they don't build them the way they used to is true. The truth, though, is that in the absence of building codes, a greater number of poorly constructed buildings were erected in the 19th century than are erected today. Interestingly enough, it's simply that the finest, more finely crafted buildings are the ones that have survived, and those are the ones that we are always making comparisons with. So that's why we always say, oh well, they built them so much better than. Well, that's all that's really survived. So that's one of the reasons we always say that. Tonight I want to look at what we discovered in our recent investigation of the first floor here of the Turner Dodge House, and I want to do it within the context of building conservation. So as I go along, I want to do a bunch of different things. Also, if we have time, I'd like to give a brief demonstration of how we use a microscope for understanding earlier paint colors. So what we have here is I have a video camera hooked up to my microscope, and we're going to kick it right onto the screen so you can actually see how we look at paint layers to understand what's happened in a building's paint history. So I think I want to start by defining some terms. The first term that we all use, or you've heard used, is historic preservation, and that's the umbrella term for what it is that we do when we look at preserving buildings. Historic preservation includes preservation planners, people who are on the Historic District Commission, as well as house museum managers, and people like myself, building conservator. The other term that we often use is restoration. We use the term restoration for the process where we use new materials to return a building back to a specific point in history. Now, that particular point in history we refer to as a target date. And on the Michigan State Capitol, for example, the target date was the 1880s to the 1890s. Now, although the building was built and actually constructed and completed in 1879, we had to move it forward a little bit because the inside of the building wasn't heavily decorated until the 1880s and 90s. So the superb interior decorative painting was done some 10 to 15 years later. So now the present target date for the Turner Dodge House is 1900 to 1903, and that's what we're going to be looking at today. Although the building was originally constructed in 1858, so many changes were made to the building during the second building campaign, and that happened right at the turn of the century, that to try to return it to that earlier period just doesn't make any sense. We'd end up doing major demolition, removing a lot of things that, well, that are really important and now are integral to the house itself. So it makes a lot more sense for us to target date this building to the 1900 to 1903 building period. The final term I want to discuss for a second is conservation. I know a couple people here were in a class that I was teaching last summer, so they've heard some of this. Now, when I talk about conservation, I don't mean like Ducks Unlimited, you know, and I've actually gotten that from people before. I'm thinking, oh no, I got to back up a little bit. Conservation refers to preserving buildings in as intact a manner as possible. As a conservator, I follow the Code of Ethics and Guidelines for Practice for the American Institute for Conservation, or we call it AIC for short. The primary tenets of the AIC Code of Ethics are pretty straightforward. They involve retaining as much original building materials as possible. It also, we always try to fully document everything that we do. That means we take a lot of pictures, we take a lot of notes, we always have an initial report and a final report. We do that so that the people who follow behind us know exactly what it is that we did when they go to follow up and do treatments, say 20 years or even 5 years in the future. We also flag old work from new. It's really important that if we come in and we repaint a section exactly like it was originally painted or painted during its target date period, that in some way we either document that or we change it just slightly so that people can tell old from new. We do that because it's important that we don't lie. That's what it really comes down to. If we do our jobs right, then people are going to understand what is old and what is new. I guess the sort of the underlying basis for everything that I do as a conservator is that historic building materials, original materials, are intrinsically important, that they're significant. And one of the things that we look at often in building conservation, I use this regularly, is that if somebody came and offered you tickets to go to the Mona Lisa that was touring, you probably want to go. But if somebody came to you and said, I have tickets to a Mona Lisa, but it's not the original Mona Lisa, it's based on the original Mona Lisa, you're not likely to go. Okay? It's true that it's the real stuff. It's the original material that makes it important. The reason that people go to Greenfield Village is because the buildings there are the real stuff. They're the original buildings. And it's not Disneyland, it is original. The other thing that we do is we always try to make sure that all of our treatments are reversible. And that's one of the toughest things that we have to do. What we've learned over time through carrying out bad treatments, often in the past, is that if you can't actually remove or undo what it is that you do, then you might be in trouble if you've made a mistake. So what we figured out is that if for instance, we apply a clear coating to a painted surface, an original painted surface, we want to make sure that we can remove that. We can use a solvent or a cleaner or whatever to actually remove it and get it off, just in case it interacts in ways that we can't foresee, or if we've made a mistake. So all of those things are important when we look at building conservation. But the most important thing that we have to keep in mind always is that all the work done on historic buildings should always be governed by an uncompromising respect for the architects, the builders, the artists, and the people who lived in the house. And that's what you always have to keep in mind whenever you're approaching a historic building and doing anything with it. Now I want to take a look at the recent investigation that we did here. The goal in the investigation was to figure out the original paints and finishes that were applied on the first floor of the house. We limited it to the first floor just because we wanted to phase this project in. The idea is we'll do it a little bit at a time. So what I want to do is I want to start in the music room. That's where we are right now. And I'm going to move in a counterclockwise way around the house and talk about what it is that we found in each of the houses, in each of the rooms. And again, as we go along, if there's something you don't understand, jump in and ask me. That's what I'm here for. The main way that we figured out what had happened in the 1900-1903 period was by taking paint samples and looking at them under the microscope. We took samples of all the walls, ceilings, all the different interior elements, and did a big comparison, a long, fairly complex comparison to figure out what was going on. Microscopic paint analysis relies on the archaeological model for analyzing paint. The archaeological model posits that things that are lowest in an actual stratigraphy are going to be the oldest. So, for instance, when you do a dig in an archaeological site, obviously the further down you dig, the further you're going back in history. We're doing the same thing when we look at paint samples. So actually, you know what? I have something I want to pass around. This is a sample that I took from the ceiling of the Union League of Philadelphia. It was a section from a big part of the ceiling that had collapsed. What I did here was, using chemicals and actually using scalpels, I removed one layer of paint at a time, going all the way back. So I'm going to pass this around. People can take a look at it. You can see that it starts right up here, and it steps down, and then steps down again until you see a lot of gold right in here. That's the original decoration that was carried out on the ceiling. So go ahead and pass it around. It's not a terribly significant artifact, but I think it outlines pretty well what it is that I'm going to be talking about. Now, we knew that understanding...
You got a hand back there.
I have a question.
Oh, yes.
Are you in the process of doing this now, or have you already redone?
No,
You're still investigating?
No, we finished the investigation, we finished the report, and now we're looking at actually restoring the interior to the 1900 and 1903 period. And it's difficult. I mean, figuring out, see, at the Michigan State Capitol, all we had to do was we had to go back to the earliest layers of decorative treatments there. It was pretty straightforward. The way that those walls were treated was that they got a calcimine paint put on them first, which is just a mixture of glue, pigment, and water. And then when it came time to do the decorating 10 or 15 years later, they washed that off and they applied the decorative paint. So what we did there was we just used chemicals to expose back to those original designs. And then we took paint samples and looked under the microscope. And hey, the earliest paint layers are what we were looking at, or what we were looking for. Now, with this, the earliest paint layers are not what we're shooting for, because the building was built in 1858. So we have to move forward in time. Well, when you start looking at a bunch of paint layers, and you'll see it in a little while, it's going to become kind of confusing. When we take a paint sample, we take all of the layers, including the substrate. So if we have paint that's been put on plaster, we actually take some of the plaster, because as we start to look, we have to know where we're going to start from. So we need to look at plaster, then paint, whatever. we had some luck here, and most projects have. Luckily, I often run into this, which the music room here, we knew that there was a wall that pretty much ran right where I'm sitting, right through the middle of this room, and broke it up into two separate rooms. It's true on the other side as well. When we do the tour, actually, we can talk about that. So that wall was removed in the 1900 to 1903 building campaign. So when I went to take paint samples, I knew that if I figured out exactly where that wall had been taken out, and I took paint samples from where it had been patched and then painted, it was there, 1900, 1903, and that's what we did. We also took the information that we found and compared it to the information that we had from family interviews, and they jive pretty well. So we're pretty comfortable with the colors that we've come up with. So music room, the walls were originally, what we found was a light green, and the ceiling itself was a yellow, the coffers were yellow, and then the beams were a slightly softer yellow, and then the cornice was beige. I actually, when I approached this room, I thought that what we were going to find was varnish because of the wooden beams. I thought that they would have been finished off as they were in the dining room. Didn't prove to be the case. I found no traces of any varnish. What we found was that it had originally been painted. It was treated very different than the other room. Let's see. Also, I think the most interesting thing about this whole room was when I took paint samples of the radiators, which, because of a previous report that had been done on the building, we knew that the heating system, present heating system, it's a hot water system, was put in again at that 1900, 1903 period. So we knew that whatever the original colors were on the radiators, that would be the colors we were target dating. I found a bright scarlet as the first paint. It's odd. I don't understand it. I don't know why it was painted a bright scarlet. Who knows? There's no accounting for tastes. But that's what we found. Actually, I have a sample of it here. So when we go to look at it, you can take a look and you can see what I found. Now, as we move into the receiving hall, some other major changes were made again in 1900, 1903. The way that the staircase used to come down, it used to come down and turn. Now it comes down at a different angle. In 1900, 1903, also the beam and the decorative columns were installed as well. Sampling the walls, found no traces of any paint, which is a clear indication that the walls have always been wallpapered. They're wallpapered right now. So our recommendation is to find a period wallpaper that is appropriate to 1903 and return the walls to that wallpaper. We found no traces of any of the original wallpaper in there, unfortunately. That's the way it goes with wallpaper. The woodwork, because of a previous report that had been done and because of some little scratching and investigation I had done, I was guessing that the woodwork in here was either going to be grained or it was going to be unfigured. I thought it would just be a soft, pulpy wood, nothing really interesting. I sampled everything, and I sampled all the different elements, and I got them under the microscope, and they were looking really strange. I didn't know why. The substrate was very, very dark. It's deep, deep, dark, reddish brown. So I came back and did an exposure. You can see it over here, where I actually stripped back a section, and it turned out that they were walnut. It's a beautiful figured walnut. Now, some of the other wood in the room looks as if it was butternut, which is often called white walnut. We think that may have been stained back to look like the walnut, but we're still not sure. Recommendation there is to go back to the original walnut because it's so beautiful. The tin ceiling in here really gave me pause. To tell you the truth, I'm really not used to having tin ceilings in a residential setting. You usually don't see it. Even a building this scale, you usually still have either wallpapered or painted ceilings. You see them in stores, you see them in a lot of businesses, but just not in houses. The story was, and this had come down to the family, that a member of the family knew someone who was in the tin ceiling business, and that's why they had put tin ceilings in the 1900, 1903 period. I was skeptical, but by looking at a couple of holes in the ceiling, I could see some color. So, talking it over with Liz Homer, we decided to pull back a section of the ceiling, the tin, and underneath we found incredible wallpapers. They were just beautiful. They were done in 5 and 6 different patterns that have been laid in, so that the first front entryway, the alcove, was done with one paper, and then the other main part of the entryway was done in a different set of papers, really. I actually cut a section out and sent it off for analysis to a woman in Connecticut, and she dated the wallpaper to 1880s, 1870s, 1880s. So I said, okay, we have Victorian wallpaper under there, 1900, 1903. Probably the first treatment is the tin ceiling. It does make sense. So I was wrong, and they were right. Sampled the tin ceiling, and what we found was that at the factory it had been coated with a deep electric blue color, but that was never meant to be seen. It was treated that way to keep it from flash rusting. The tin ceiling was applied, and it was painted in off-white, and then they applied a glaze over that, an umber glaze. I don't know, do people know what glazes are or how they're applied? A glaze is a translucent paint. It's a paint with very, very little body to it. And the way that it's used is that it's brushed, or sometimes rolled, but usually brushed on, and it's stippled out. And particularly where you have kinds of treatments like the tin ceiling in here, where you have raised areas and then you have recesses, the glaze is left in the recesses, so you become very dark, and wiped off with the high points, so you have this depth that it gives to the ceiling. Now, glazes were also often used on walls, and I didn't know what we were going to find, but even where you have long expanses of flat walls, they're often painted and they're glazed and stippled or ragged. People use wallpaper, newspaper, and all different things to give a different texture. There's a depth and kind of life to walls that we don't usually see any longer. So what we had on those was off-white and then an umber glaze. Let's see. Okay, then we move into the dining room. The dining room is set up pretty much like this room. And again, I knew from the original floor plans that a wall had been taken out. Did the same thing. We figured out exactly where the center of the room was. We took samples on both sides. We looked, we had different paint colors going up to a certain point, and then they become the same. Also took a paint sample from where we thought the wall had been taken out. And sure enough, the first color that we find there is a point where these other two rooms become the same color. Just by the way, in Victorian America, bedrooms, when they were on the first floor, were called bedrooms. When they were on the second or third floor, they were called bed chambers. So these were bedrooms, and so they actually were treated pretty. They were painted pretty regularly. There was a lot of paint thickers on there. The dining room. Let's see. The colors that we found in the dining room were a peach in the ceiling. It was a light peach. Again, that was what one of the family members had told us in an interview we were going to find. On the walls, there's a plate rail which runs along, which we don't have in here. Above and below the plate rail, it was painted a coral color, and then it had an ochre glaze over it. So again, it was an ochre glaze, and then it was stippled out. The radiators in that room were bronzed. Bronzing was so common on radiators that it's often called radiator paint. It was used on the state capitol quite a few areas too. What bronzing is bronze powder. It's actually they take the metal bronze, they pulverize it really, really fine, and then they suspend it in nitrocellulose, which is a clear coating, and then it's just painted on. When it's originally painted on, it looks pretty much like gold leaf. Very, very bright, really exuberant. But the biggest problem with bronze powders is that they're very unstable. It's bronze. I mean, what does bronze do when it's outside? Brown to green. And actually, I've used bronze powder quite a bit. And you paint it on, and as you're painting, you can see these dark streaks appearing as you go. But the nitrocellulose, the idea is that the clear coating coats each of the particles and keeps them from actually being in contact with the oxygen, which is going to cause the oxidation and the instability of it. So I found a bronze powder. It looks kind of green and granular, and then brown, and then gold in some places too. So then we move into the pantry. The pantry had a lot of problems. I took a lot of samples from the woodwork in there. Most of the room was woodwork. I took 44 samples and found all different kinds of colors. The problem there was that at some point in the history of the building, I think it was in the 1970s, all the woodwork was stripped, which doesn't mean that there's no information left, but what it means is that all those different paint layers are put into, are mixed up, and you end up with green and brown and all different colors being pushed into the grain of the wood, so it's hard to tell what's going on. But the thing that I did find in a couple of places was varnish, and I found that varnish pretty regularly. So my recommendation was that all the woodwork in the pantry should be varnished. The walls were painted a beige, pretty straightforward beige. Again, the walls had been messed about pretty well. There was a lot of patching, a lot of problems with it. But on one area, way underneath the plate warmer, which is on the west wall, I found a nice stratigraphy that had about 15, 16 layers of paint on it. I was confident that we were looking at an early set of layers. Probably the most interesting thing that I found in the pantry was that I sampled the plate warmer pipes. So when you walk through, you'll see that there are these water pipes that run underneath the plate warmer. The idea of the plate warmer was obviously you put plates in there when you're having a party, you take them out, they're nice and hot, and people have their food stay warm. But the plate warmer pipes were, again, bronze, so they would have looked bright gold when they were originally done, at least for 4 or 5 years until they started to break down. Now, the way that we dealt with that, the way we dealt with it in the state capitol, was we now have materials that are much more stable. There's something, I'm going to say this, it always makes me sound like a techno or something, but titanium-coated mica crystals are the way that we go when we're looking at metallics these days. They're suspended in a clear acrylic medium. What they do is they actually take a little tiny crystal of mica and they coat it with titanium. They bring it up to a certain temperature, and depending on the temperature that they bring it up to, they can get any metallic color they want. So it can be green or bronze or copper or a bright gold. What we're using now are those in place of the bronze powders. And in the state capitol where we used them 10 years ago, they're still incredibly stable. So that's what I'm recommending. Let's see. In the kitchen, again, the kitchen had, a lot of it had been drywalled, but on the west end of the kitchen, I did find some areas on the ceiling that had a high gloss yellow that appears to be our target layer. So I'm recommending that we have a high gloss yellow on the ceiling. It makes sense that you'd have a high gloss paint in there because there's a lot of cooking going on and grease, a lot easier to clean. I didn't find any paint evidence on the walls themselves. So I'm thinking that they also probably were wallpaper. I did find 4 or 5 places where we had many layers of wallpaper adhesive. And I could actually count the layers with dirt in between them. So that told me that it had been wallpapered over and over and over again. So I'm recommending that we wallpaper those.
Was the gloss yellow of the ceiling in the kitchen?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. The woodwork has been changed in there. A lot of it's been stripped out and put back in. I found a green color regularly. I think the green was a much later addition to the paint stratigraphy. But again, what I did find was a varnish layer that was pretty consistent. So I'm recommending that all the woodwork in the kitchen be stripped and varnished. So let's go all the way full circle. It takes us to the library here. In the library, the ceiling is a tin ceiling, and I sampled it, found the same colors that we had in the entryway, which makes sense. A lot of continuity between those 2 rooms. The walls, like the entry, were also wallpaper. The woodwork, though, was interesting. I found some areas that were walnut as well, and then I found other areas that were softer wood that had been added in later, and those had been grained. I don't know if people here know what grain painting is. Graining was done widely in the Victorian period, and it was used actually as a status symbol. So you have situation. What you have is, again, they use glazes. You paint out a base coat, And then you use a glaze that you actually run run some glazing tools through, or grading tools through, that give you grain. And the stuff in the state capitol will amaze you if you haven't ever seen it. You can get right up to it and it looks just like walnut. It's done in 3 or 4 different layers. So I found graining in there, and we were able to uncover enough of it that we should be able to replicate that graining. I think what happened was that they wanted to keep the walnut, but they couldn't get the walnut. So they added softwoods, and they grained the softwoods around it to look like the walnut, and that's fairly common. So, so that takes us all the way around, pretty much. A friend of mine from Philadelphia likes to say that there are 3 kinds of buildings: those you fight for, those you trade, and those you die for. And this is certainly one of those buildings to die for. And I'm hoping that it survives and continues to teach us about history far in the future. So, thank you. Yes?
When you look at this piece that you passed around, how do you know when you're at the original layer? How do you know when to stop?
You hit plaster. Or, well, actually, I should be a little more straightforward here. Paint, most painting I say painting campaign. Each painting campaign is, every time you go to repaint something, that's a painting campaign. Most painting campaigns are at least 2 layers, depending on if you're lazy or not. Primer and a finish coat. So, and usually primers, you can tell if it's a primer because it's going to be gray or an off-white. Not always, but usually can. The other way that we tell, the other way that we tell when something is a primer and where layers stop and start is by dirt layers. So when we get under the microscope, we start going through layers, and we'll say, well, Anglo-Japanese wallpaper that we found on the ceiling section on the far end. So can we pass this down, or we can pass this down? I know people come up and take a look at it as we go through. So you can see that we've got a bunch of different papers that have been put together here to make up the entire.
Question in the background.
Yes, ma'am.
Is the tour gonna go upstairs?
I don't know. Rita, are you going to be?
Yeah, it's gonna
Okay,
go upstairs.
Yeah, I think we'll go through the whole house.
The woodwork is real dark and then the fireplace is lighter. I know the fireplace is more problem. Was it?
Yeah, actually, probably the floors should have been a little darker than they are. The floors should be the darkest wood in a room generally. And this was actually restored a few years ago, and I'm not sure what, I mean, I wasn't asked to treat those because I think they're going to stay the way that they are.
They look like the pages.
Where was the wall in here? This one?
Well, yeah, wall pretty much ran the center of the room.
So that wasn't there.
This was added in later.
When you mentioned this in its previous state, and this was bedrooms, did I capture that properly?
I'm not sure if this was bedrooms. We know that the rooms on the other side were bedrooms. They believe that this was, but they're not sure. At least from what I've been able to tell.
And the kitchen was in the basement originally.
Yeah, kitchen was in the basement originally. Yes, ma'am.
What's the difference between a bedroom and a bed chamber? Is the bedroom where you just relax in the afternoon, and the bed chamber is where you finally retire, or
I think it
varies?
it's just upstairs, downstairs. Bed chamber upstairs, bedroom downstairs. I think it ends up being the same thing.
Have they made any decisions about window treatments and floor treatments and such? Are they gonna let the changes take place in them?
You know, there's a woman named Gail Winkler who did the initial report for this building. She's the author of Victorian Interior Decoration. She's fabulous. She's one of my professors at Penn too. But I mean, she's really, really good. And my guess is that they'll ask her to take a look at the window treatments. And there are some historic photographs of this room, so I would guess that they'll try to work off of those as much as they can. The other thing that I forgot to say was that the green in here makes a lot of sense for a bunch of reasons. Partly because of what we found, partly because of that we have family interviews where people actually have memories of this being green, which is interesting that I found what the family thought had been here. Because the truth is that color memory in human beings is atrocious. Anybody that's ever looked at a color at home and and I said, I'm gonna go to the paint store and match that. So you go to the paint store, you come back completely different color. We're all terrible at it. It's one of the problems with human vision. But, you know, he remembered it well enough that he could remember peach and green. That's close enough.
A slight anecdotal, if I may.
Sure.
Those of you who have never visited Calkins Paint Store, there is a sign that says, any male appearing must have a note with permission from his wife to pick colors.
Now, but the family members didn't have any recollection of the radiators being,
No, but I don't know when they were
just
over.
curious.
I don't know when they were overpainted though. They may have been overpainted within a few years. The other thing is that green makes a lot of sense in a music room. Green was the usual color for music rooms and for libraries, because in the Victorian period it was believed to be very easy on the eyes. So it makes a lot of sense.
Is that a real light green, or is it more like institutional green of the 40s?
That was a lighter green. It was a lighter green. Yeah, I know. I mean, I have to tell you, I've been working on the, as Judge Allen mentioned, I'm working on the Adams House in Deadwood, South Dakota. And the decision there was made, the building was built at the end of the 19th century, but they're going back to 1932 because, well, for a lot of different reasons, but for the most part because that's the period of greatest significance. It's when the family that was really important owned the house. And I gotta tell you, we have some beautiful decorative painting in that house, and then we have some really bad wallpapers, 1930s wallpapers. But they made the decision to go back to 1932, that's what they're gonna do. And what we had to do, well, we didn't have to, but what we did there was we actually cut windows, almost windows back through history in each of the rooms so that people could see what the original decorative treatments were. But most of the room is finished off in wallpaper. So you know, there are ways that you can work around it. You know, if you don't like the color. My opinion is that buildings have to function. They're a living machine. You know, we have to be able to live in them, and if they don't fulfill that function, then they fail. They're not likely to survive for a long time. So, paint color's emotional issue. Probably the most emotional issue that we have in this field. And so, when it's a person's house, I say, you really need to make the decision for what you want. If it's a house museum, then historically, maybe it's better to go back to something even if you don't like it.
They use blues in Victoria?
Sure. Oh, yeah.
Light blues?
They use some light blues, sure. Yeah. Depends on when in the Victorian. About 1860, major changes in painting in the United States because of the invention of the resealable paint can. Suddenly, companies popped up all over the United States that were able to manufacture paint and sell it ready-made. Prior to that, all paint was pretty much ground by hand on site. So a painter would come on site and he would have a big flat grinder and he'd get out his oil, his linseed oil and his white lead, and start mixing his pigments in, and he'd mix every single room separate until you got what you wanted. Yeah.
Light
Toxic too.
Light blue used to show up in porch ceilings, no matter what the rest of the color of the porch was.
Right.
Ugly like sky.
Exactly. Floor is usually gray. And furniture on a Victorian porch almost always green. Yes, sir.
Speaking of living in buildings, when was the last time someone, like a family, lived here?
No, I'm not sure. The building has gone through an interesting evolution, and it was owned by the Great Lakes Bible College for a while. Actually, we were talking about that a little earlier because
I actually said that comment to my wife, and she said, "No way." Said that on the way in.
what's that?
Never mind. You just.
Oh, you won that argument.
Sorry.
Yeah, what was it before Great Lakes?
What was it? You know, I don't know actually. And Liz Homer,
McClellan's.
McLeod's. Oh,
McClellan's
Okay.
owned this and sold it to the city.
okay. All right.
And I don't know, just, the dates.
I don't have the full evolution of the full chain of title. Yes, you're waving your hand.
I was wondering why the kitchen was moved upstairs.
I think for different reasons. I think the biggest reason was that there was a change societally in the United States that help was I think in the Victorian period you really wanted help very, very separate from where you lived, and they were sort of supposed to be seen and not heard. And by the turn of the century, we have some major changes that are occurring as far as I think the way that help is and conservator looked at in the United States, but also, there were a lot of cooking, there were a lot of big changes that were made in cooking. Suddenly gas stoves were becoming available. I think the stove in here is gas coal, isn't it? Is it gas and wood burning?
That is not an original.
No, it's not the original stove, but it's appropriate to the period.
Coal stove.
Coal stove.
Okay.
So,
You can't cook.
I'm not sure personally, I don't know why the decisions were made. We did find a couple of other interesting, one other interesting thing that I thought was pretty neat was, in the dining room, one of the fireplaces was removed. It had been put in the 1900 renovation, and then it was removed when this was owned by the Great Lakes Bible College. I'm not quite sure why, but, I wanted to know exactly where it had been set. I went down to the basement and I was trying to figure it out from the framing, and I found pieces of a crate that actually had stenciled across it the Grand Rapids clock and mantle company. So we know who made the mantle, even though it's gone. So it gets us a little closer to if we decide to put another fireplace in there, at least we're a little closer to figuring out what's going to go.
Which room?
That's in the dining room. Yeah.
South wall?
West wall.
West wall.
Yeah.
Into the pantry.
Yeah.
Ron,
Yes.
you've talked about the walls and the ceilings and so on. Would you like to comment about the flooring? One of the questions that we have had is our friends of Turner Dodge. The building is owned by the city, but the initiative on all of its redecoration and restoration is being taken by the charitable corporation, the Friends of Turner Dodge House. And our board has been conflicted and somewhat ambivalent about what do we do, if anything, about the floors. Is it necessary that we go back to the original floors? What is the condition of the present flooring? Have you any recommendations on that?
Well, the floor in here is a pretty finely grained, what is it here? Is it, I think it's maple, isn't it?
I think it is.
I think this is maple. I think this, you're not talking about this floor.
No, I'm
This-
not
this
talking
is
about
what-
this floor that was supposedly be handled as part of the exterior and the interior of this room.
Okay, I know that there are some serious problems with the flooring in the entry hall, particularly the receiving hall. And I came in a couple of years ago and looked at that with Liz, and I made some recommendations. It's a problem. There are a lot of, the way that the floors are put in is tongue and groove. A lot of the tongues have been snapped off. There have been some replacement boards put in, but I think we probably have about 65–70% of the original flooring in it. And when I say original, I mean 1900, 1903. We have an earlier floor underneath this that was put down in the 1850s during construction. My recommendations were to keep as much of the original floor
That's
as possible.
1900.
Yeah, but at the same time, replace what actually is damaged and is taking away from the aesthetic integrity of the floor. It's also hard to maintain. You've got big cracks and it picks up dust. It might even be a trip hazard if it gets bad enough. So, does that answer your question? I mean, my recommendation was to replace, what was badly damaged and retain. I'm a conservator. That's my opinion. I'm going to tell you to keep original material whenever you can.
I have some information the judge doesn't have.
Okay.
They had brought in a flooring company guy to take a look at the whole floor. I was of the opinion that I wanted to patch and replace.
Yeah.
However, in talking with them, they made me go back and look at something I had not looked at. And you have the tongue, but you also have a groove.
Yeah.
The thickness of the top part of the groove from sandings is so thin, it's about a 1/16 of an inch, and that's why they're all splitting.
Okay.
And there is some, if you go in there and walk in certain areas, I know where they are because I've done it many times, there's some floors loose, stuff needs to come up, it needs to be restabilized. And in my opinion at first was, I want to fill it, I'll take a planing machine, I'll get new wood, I'll thin it down and match the other, take the bottom part of the groove out and top nail it and then countersink it and fill the holes. it turns out it's gonna be about 40% of the floor, and then the next time it's sanded, all the other 60%, all the groove tops will come off.
Right.
So I changed my recommendation and go ahead and
You know, it's a problem, and it is gonna be a judgment call. It also depends on how they treat it. If they go over it with a sander, yeah, but there are other ways to treat the floor. I mean, you can strip a floor and refinish too, without taking off a lot of material, although finding somebody to do it, that's really the issue. So all I was able to do was give my best run at it, which was from a conservator's point of view. And yeah, there are other issues involved, and I'm not, you know, I was just asking my opinion. I wasn't paid for that or anything, I was just.
I remember what the Old House Journal says, when you sand old floors, you have a brand new floor made out of old wood.
Right.
Because you lose all the patina and character.
Well, these floors were actually refinished during the last restoration, which, I don't know what year that was, but I know there were a lot of serious problems with the finishes that were put down on them. They remained sticky for months and months at a time. I think they ended up having to come in and refinish some of the rooms. They had to close off some of the rooms for a month or so. It was a problem. So that may be one of the other reasons why there's so much serious wear, because they had to come back and refinish those a second time. And maybe that may have been the third or fourth time they've been refinished, so I don't know. Was that, there's some questions back here, yeah.
Ron, I take it that when this room was 2 rooms, those beams were on there.
Right, exactly. I should have made that clear. The beams, yeah, it wouldn't have made any sense otherwise. The beams, cornice, and the coffers. Now, parts of the coffers may be original. I'm not sure.
Which is the coffers?
Coffers are the inside of the beams.
The big panels.
Yeah, the big panels. So they may have put the beams up to the original plaster, they may have replastered. It looks as if they at least skim coated most of it though. So, Mike.
And secondly, do you know how this room was, what guided the decoration of the room the way it is now?
Yeah, Gail Winkler was the person who had written the initial report. Now, Gail Winkler was only involved in the first draft. She wasn't involved in any of the window treatments in here. That came later. She wasn't involved in the wallpaper either, but she made recommendations for because this wallpaper was put in during the decorator showcase, I believe. 1980s? Late 70s, 1980s. This isn't historically appropriate.
That they came in?
No, the plan is to restore it. It's appropriate.
Are they gonna do anything with the exterior?
A lot has already been done on the exterior. I think they've done a magnificent job. What in particular do you do?
No, I just was
Okay,
curious.
yeah, they've done a lot of work on and that's the way that it should be. I mean, you really hit the exterior first. You work on the roof, you work on the walls, make everything as tight as you can, so that when you do put the money into the inside, it's going to be safe from water infiltration. Yes, ma'am?
Do you anticipate the stripping of the woodwork around the windows? And if so, will it be taken apart to be stripped or left in place?
I don't. The window treatments in here were really beyond the scope of what I was recommending. I'd be glad to look at it more closely, but I haven't thus far. I mean, when it comes to the recommendations that I made, I'd like to help them through, I'd like to make sure that they happen. So I've offered my own time. I'll come in and work with volunteers. I'll work with however, to reglaze the ceilings in there. The windows in here were outside the scope of what I was investigating.
Why do you think you found different types of wood on this floor? I live in a house that was built in 1894, and we were going to redo all the woodwork upstairs. And in stripping it, we found that it was pine, and everything on the first floor was oak. Was that typical of the period?
It is. What you have is public areas are going to be high style. Private areas are going to be low style generally. My house is over on Willow, and it's late 1870s. Major redo in about 1900, about the same time as this house was redone. The whole downstairs is all oak. It's beautiful, except somebody overpainted everything with a mop, I think. But in there, I've been actually uncovering all of the oak very slowly, and actually retaining the original varnish and the original stains too, which has been fun. Upstairs, everything was pine, but in my house, they grained all the doors and windows and, as well as the baseboards, which has been fun, because I was lucky, they grained it and then they varnished it, and then there were a couple people in the house that smoked like chimneys. And the nicotine on the woodwork, they didn't wash it off properly, so when they went to paint over it, they didn't get very good adhesion, so I'm able to just take a chisel and take the paint right off and right back to where I want to be. And then like, we also a lot of duct tape. Duct tape is great for paint. And I should tell the story for a second. Gail Winkler, one of my professors, I originally told her that I was interested in using duct tape for paint removal, and she just laughed at me, thought it was the silliest thing. Well, I did a couple of projects in Detroit where we used it, and it really worked. And she called me about 3 months ago and said that she was on a project, and they said, well, we think there might be, graining under here. And she said, well, go get some duct tape. She said, it worked great. I said, Gail, you ain't laughing now, are you?
Do you have to leave that duct tape on for a little while?
No, actually, you put it on, you use the rounded side of a spoon, and you burnish it a little bit to get it to really stick. And then it takes a little work. It doesn't work in every situation, but yeah, if you're uncovering varnished woodwork, it works like a charm. So, anyway. Yes, sir.
Can you tell what actual colors there were by chemical composition, or do you actually see the colors, which I would think would fade? Or?
Yeah. Most of the paints in this house were oil paints. So they were linseed oil and white lead, and then pigments. And linseed oil and white lead is one of the finest paints that have ever been made. It's toxic as anything, but it does make a great paint. The problem with linseed oil is exactly what you're talking about. It's not very stable. It yellows in the absence of light. So if you put layers of paint over it, it's in the dark, and it yellows much more quickly than even if it's exposed. What we know about it, in different kinds of linseed oil will yellow at different rates, but what we do know is that blues tend to look a little more green, reds tend to look a little bit more orange, and we allow for that color shift. Now, if a color is a really saturated color, like the scarlet I'm going to show you, it's not affected that much. Yes, we do use chemical analysis for pigments, and that often will give us the information we need. The problem there is that it's usually expensive, and I do use a polarizing light microscope sometimes to do pigment analysis. And what we do is we look at it in polarized light. I won't go into detail with it, but what you do is you look at it and you change the light. And the point at which the light changes will tell you what specifically the pigment is, and then you look it up in a book and you do comparisons. And from that you can tell what the pigments are. And that will often give you a lot of information. So here, though, we're doing color analysis. It's a lot more straightforward. It's a little crude, quite frankly. And there is a little bit of guesswork involved, and everybody's eye is a little bit different. So those are all issues we have to take into account. Yes, sir?
You had mentioned gloss in the 1900 era, which I thought was a little surprising, I guess. But what you're telling us is that there was the ability to have anywhere from flat to semi-gloss to gloss.
Sure. Gloss is determined by your oil to pigment ratio and your oil to white lead ratio too. But yeah, they can get very flat paints, and I mean fairly flat, not quite as flat as we get now, but pretty flat. If you wanted a flat paint, usually you'd go with a calcimine or a distemper, which is dead flat, and that's, again, it's made out of chalk. Yeah, ground chalk, pigment, a little bit of hydrogen and water. So, with that.
Yeah. Excellent. Thank you.
Yeah. So, yeah, the truth is that most historic paints looked a lot different than what we're used to. They tend to be really ropey. They didn't brush out quite as nicely. They didn't have the levelers in them. It was a different kind of material than what we're used to today. And it dried really slowly. White lead and linseed oil paints could take 10, 12, 20 days to dry on an exterior. They did have dryers, which are manganese and lead soaps that they added to speed up the drying process, and we still do that. But depending on how much they put in or who was doing it, sometimes it took an eternity to dry. So too, so.
Are you gonna use the same type of paint when you paint this, or are you gonna use today's paint?
We use today's paints. The problem is, obviously, with lead, that's really not an option. If I had found calcimines, we could do that, which is, again, chalk and pigment, blue water. Problem there is that they're fully water soluble. So every time somebody walked through, had a sweaty hand across it, they could take it right off. But, I mean, it's an option. Lead really isn't an option these days.
For that time period, would the home have been electrified with light, or would it have still been gas-powered light? And if so, would any fixtures be changed to reflect what would have been?
I don't, I'm not sure when, I know the building was electrified very, very early. Yes, sir.
Yes, for that time period, it was electrified.
Yeah.
None of the light fixtures that you see in the house were electrified. The exception of one in the dining room ceiling are original. We'll be in the process of changing some light fixtures too. We'll change walls and ceilings and radiators.
Did you find any evidence of stenciling in the home anywhere, or?
None. I was hoping that I would.
Yeah.
But I love that. And that, again, that's what got me into this, was working on the state capitol and doing, I mean, I exposed hundreds of square feet of decoration there. Every day was a party. I got it every single day. No, I mean, it's so much fun because you don't know what's there. You start uncovering it. It's this voyage of discovery. No, I didn't find any evidence of that at all. I did take samples high and low and look. Didn't find anything, unfortunately. Would have been nice.
You did a fabulous job on that. We like it.
Well, I had some help.
I know, but we really did enjoy going and taking a tour there. It was really great.
It's a fabulous building, and I feel really fortunate to have had the chance to work on it. It's a lot of fun.
Have you been in Kelly Rossman's building on Washington Street there, the Italianate, that's just north of
I have.
Oakland? The lady that owned it prior to it becoming the PR agency, I can't remember her name, but she rented out rooms to female senators. It was a rooming house. Her dining room, she took the wallpaper off and discovered a full ceiling mural, hand painted. And it's there. If you ever get a chance to go in there, you'll see it.
It's interesting that the state capitol, the construction of the state capitol brought, I mean, the way that they brought the decorative painting into the building was that they advertised throughout the United States for decorative painters, because it's still a fairly small town. And we got a large number of people coming in, particularly from upstate New York, interestingly enough. A lot of German immigrants were coming into the country at that point, craftsmen, and so 1870s, 1880s, that's when they were advertising for people. A lot of people moved here specifically to decorate our Capitol. And then, if we don't know very much about it, because that was all subcontracted. So occasionally we'll find a signature of one of the doorways in the Capitol, but for the most part, they're unsung heroes. The really interesting thing is that when the restoration happened, the same thing happened again. You have these group of itinerant decorative painters who came through and worked, and that project brought together probably the finest painting craftsmen in the entire United States. We had companies that have worked on the United States Capitol, the finest buildings in the United States. They all came here to work on that building, and then afterwards there was this diaspora where they moved back out across the United States. And I still keep in touch with them. I run into them occasionally on projects here and there. And it's a real interesting thing that historically decorative painters have been itinerant. They move across the country, so that hasn't changed.
Wasn't the grading done by some Scots?
Yeah, actually John Canning, the owner of John Canning Company, brought two gentlemen from Scotland, one from, actually I think they were both one of them from outside of Edinburgh, one of them from Edinburgh itself. One gentleman was a professor of decorative painting for the guild, Scottish guilds. He was just a great teacher, and he came in and trained a lot of the decorative painters there to do the grading, including John Canning, who owned the company. So, yeah, it was fun.
I thought that was amazing, man, to find somebody from another country to do it.
Well, now you wouldn't have any trouble. That was 10 years ago, but the number of craftsmen that are available now is increased dramatically, just because of so many restoration projects have started. So should we take a look at a paint sample? Go ahead. Read it. switch this?
I think you need to turn it on from the front. There's a power button.
Sorry, you see it on?
There's a round button in the front. To the right.
Are we, no, I can't see it, which is, tell me when I'm in focus.
I don't want anyone's view here.
Pretty focused?
Selection, English or Espanol?
Oh, there's the-
Up arrow, please.
How are we? That's good. Are we clear? Okay, you can see that there's a little bit, there's a slight gray layer that's closest to. Really.
See that way?
Okay.
There's a little blue. Yeah.
Okay, let's go the other direction. You can see that there's a bronze brown color up at the top.
Yes.
Okay,
Yeah,
that's a
brown
color that
and
we think
blue.
was, we think that they painted the radiator that color to mimic unstable bronze powder. So it actually, that's pretty close to what bronze powder looks after it oxidizes. Okay, then we've got a slight white layer underneath that. That's a primer layer for this brown that's over it. Blue layer, this entire room was painted blue. I found it on every sample that I took. So radiators, woodwork, everything was painted blue. Okay, then we have this white layer. It's a pretty thick layer. Tells me that it was probably a fairly early paint. Okay, then we come down a little bit further. Can you see that scarlet layer? I hope you can, because it's really bright.
That red line?
Yeah, that red line, that's our scarlet layer. Okay?
Now, how did you determine that was the last layer?
Well, we've got one layer underneath it, and that's gray. And that's the primer. There's a gray primer, battleship gray primer for a radiator makes a lot of sense.
Would you come around here and point to that?
Yeah.
Because that's not making sense.
Okay. Can you see that there's just little bits of gray right in here?
Yeah.
It's hard to see it, but that's actually our primer layer. There's just a little bit of it running along here.
And then what's the
Okay.
next layer, the red?
And the red right here is a paint layer. It's a distinct paint layer, there's no question. Now, there's also a dirt layer right here. It's fairly fine, but there's a dirt layer that runs along. Okay, then we have this white layer, it's a paint layer. And we have the blue. I don't see a dirt layer here, which tells me that this may be the primer for the blue. Makes sense. Okay, and then we have, I think we have another primer here, and then we have the brown. That's the last
What's
layer.
the red streak?
Right here?
Yeah.
I'm not sure, it might be one of the hairs from one of my cats, I don't know.
Sounds reasonable.
I do have some.
to see myself.
Yeah. Thank you. See, what I do is, we take a paint sample, we cut it at a oblique angle, so that we widen out each of those layers as much as we can. The other thing that I did in some areas of the house, to give me an idea what I was looking for, I did cratering. Cratering when we, let's see, just a second. I can't walk and chew gum at the same time. So, that's not okay.
There you go, oops, there.
I mean, we're working, it's pretty small, so. You see, it's a little better, isn't it? I can zoom it in too, a little closer.
That's all above me.
That's okay, I'll get it back in focus. This. Yeah, see, that's as tight as I'm gonna be able to get it in. That's right now at about 800, magnification. What was I saying? Somebody asked me a question. Crater. What I did in some areas of the house is we take a scalpel or take an X-Acto, and we go through and we actually make a rounded crater down to the substrate. Do it someplace where it's not going to show too much. And you take a piece of sandpaper and you just sand it out so that it's that you've softened out all the rough edges. You put a drop of mineral oil on there, or a drop of varnish will do too. And you look at it with a small hand lens, and you can actually count your layers. And that gives you a good initial run at colors in an individual room. Well, if you suspect that you have stenciling in a room, you do that in 5 or 6 places. If you run into gold leaf, you know you run into something funny. but you can often tell what you're gonna run into if you decide to do a chemical exposure. So, all right, does this all make sense? Basically, this is what I did with all the samples that we took, for the whole house, the whole first floor.
The conservator,
Yeah.
and what it sounds like to me is an archaeologist of architecture.
Yeah,
in effect.
basically, I mean, it's, as a conservator, I don't just work on paint. I mean, the University of Pennsylvania's program has several core classes that focus on individual materials. So we look at brick, we understand how brick is, how the clay is won from the earth, and then it's made into bricks, and then it's fired, and then it's laid up, and how mortar works, and how bricks work as individual pieces of a building, and then how bricks decay, what happens if you sandblast a brick, and all of those issues. And we have glass and wallpaper, we have paint, plaster, another whole different field in a way. So being a conservator, I feel so fortunate to have found something that I enjoy so much. It has a hands-on component to it. On the other hand, it also has a scientific component, because we're using scientific analytical tools to understand where we are with the materials. But then we also have a historical end of it, because you have to understand not only the material itself, but how it was applied, how the craftsmen used it, how they didn't use it, particularly when we have paint. When you have decorative painting, I mean, glazes are such a weird, material themselves. They're very, very thin. So I worked as a decorative painter when I first started on the Michigan State Capitol project. I worked as a decorative painter for about 1.5 years. And it was great, because then I went through and I did exposures uncovering the same kind of painting that I had been doing for 1.5 years and documenting it. So it gave me insights into what it is that I was looking for. But yeah, it's detective work too. It's a lot of fun. Again, I feel really fortunate to
Are you
be able
from
to do
Lansing?
I'm from Michigan. I was born in Midland, and I've lived in Lansing on and off for about 20 years. So grew up in Detroit though.
We won't hold
Yes, a
that
little
against
bit
you.
of, a little bit of structural background, like local labor, local materials, etc.
I mean,
Design.
do we know about the building itself?
I know you're just discussing the renovation and the conservation of the exposed things, but I was hoping to get a little bit of information on the structural part of the house. Any of that.
Well, actually,
Is it like Darius Moore?
Where-
yeah.
He said that he was one of the architects, and I wondered what year? Was it the 1858 building, or was it the 1900 renovation? I don't know.
Which do you?
She wants to know.
I just
Who
was
actually
wondering if
did-
you're going to go into any of the structural
Yeah.
history versus the decorative.
Actually, Ron could give a little bit of that on the tour, when Ron does a tour. And, yeah, I know some of you are probably anxious to get home, right? Why don't we can thank Ron, and then if a couple people would like to look at his samples, and also we're going to do the tour with Ron Turner. We have 2 Rons tonight. Yes, yeah.
Well, I'd just like to take a minute as president of the Friends of Turner Dodge. It's so impressive to have so many people here really interested in the home. And if you're not a friend of Turner Dodge, I urge you, you can sign up. It's $35 a year, I think, and you'll get a newsletter that'll really keep you updated on what's going to happen. And with several board members are here. Bob Cochran in the red shirt, he's kind of a historian with old houses, and the fellow that's going to give you the tour, Ron Turner, is actually a descendant of the family, so he knows firsthand what's going on. Judge Allen already was introduced. He played here when he was a child, so well, I'm really impressed.
Introduce him.
But I encourage you to become a member, and we're looking for committee people to work and do things.
Let me just interrupt you to explain how. We met in an emergency session about 2.5 weeks ago, and our president died, and Merlin Allen, unexpectedly, and our vice president, who was Ed Carpenter, was running a big tree farm, and it was Christmas. So he's been busy working on his tree farm in the last 2.5 weeks that he's been president. That's why I was presiding or making the introduction tonight, but Ed is our new president, and I'm glad he's introduced. Now, back to you, Hunter.
You know, if people have questions, I'll be here. If you want to actually take a look through the microscope, you're welcome to do that. Please feel free to
Let's give him a big hand.
Yeah.